Secrets are hidden in the ocean, and occasionally cruise ships bring them directly into our world. These aren't stories from campfires. You are going to hear about actual experiences that were gathered from forums, Reddit, and first-hand accounts. These accounts have been meticulously verified to ensure that they are not merely rumors. Every detail will irritate you, from passengers who were never on the manifest to shadows that follow survivors home to cabins that don't exist. Here at Midnight Outcry, the waves are overpowered by the darkness. To start, turn off the lights, click subscribe, press the bell button, and then leave a comment letting us know which of these haunted accounts most unnerved you. Because after hearing these tales, your perspective on the water will change forever. Story 1. I never imagined that I would be on a cruise ship. Growing up on Lake Huron in Michigan, I spent half of my summers swimming till my skin wrinkled like paper. Not because I was terrified of the water or anything. No, cruises have never appealed to me. Overly ostentatious, overly contrived. As an EMT by profession, I'm accustomed to 12-hour shifts, sirens, and uniforms covered in blood. The notion of cruising around in a floating hotel that offers silly karaoke nights and unlimited buffets? For those who wish to seem as though life wasn't chaotic, it sounded like something. Melissa, my sister, wouldn't let it go though. According to her, not mine, she purchased the tickets as a healing trip. I attempted to argue with her when she suggested I needed to step outside the grind and let the ocean carry me after the year I'd had the failed engagement, the overdose call that still made me sweat at night, and the endless overtime that gnawed at my bones. Nevertheless, she thrust the ticket into my grasp. So there I was in June, Melissa by my side, aboard the Ocean Serenity, with other holidaymakers wearing floppy hats and Hawaiian shirts, their laughing drowning out the sound of flowing water and gulls. I felt as though I had strayed onto a stage play for which I had not tried out, so I kept my backpack strapped tightly to my shoulders. I was uneasy about the ship from the beginning. It wasn't the size, although my goodness, it was enormous, a floating skyscraper shining in the sunlight. No, the sound was the cause. Ships should moan and creak to alert you to the movement of 1,000 tons of metal against the water. However, this one, quiet, too quiet almost. As we exited the port, it seemed as though the water itself was holding its breath. Melissa was unaware. With the wind in her hair and a smile that seemed to erase the past 12 months, she was already taking selfies on the deck. That's what I wanted to give her. I didn't want to be the buzzkill for once. However, everything changed on the first night. The bottom deck was where our accommodation was located. It was simple, with 2 twin beds, a porthole window, and walls that were thin enough to allow us to hear our neighbors sneezing. By 11, Melissa was sound asleep on the bunk next mine, breathing steadily and softly. I listened to the ship's engines whirring while I lay awake and gazed at the ceiling. Then I heard it. There's a knock, gentle, purposeful. Cabin 6B is coming from the wall to my right. I initially believed I was dreaming. Pipes, ship sounds, whatever. Then it happened once more. This time, there are 3 knocks. Slow, disoriented. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up. Melissa stirred, but remained unconscious. I pressed my ear against the wall and swung my legs over the bed. Quiet. An EMT frightened by a knock? I nearly laughed at myself. I had witnessed yelling overdoses, stab wounds, and violent domestic abuse calls. Someone next door couldn't sleep and wanted to be sweet about it. So here I was, sweating. Crawling back into bed, I did so. I closed my eyes. Then tap, press, press. This time, not from the wall, from the porthole's interior. I opened my eyes. My face was fewer than 5 feet from the window. There was nothing but dark water for miles beyond it. Every hair on my body stood up as I froze. I slowly tilted my head toward the window, as if I didn't want to frighten whatever was outside. A face returned my gaze. White, drowned. Even though the window was bone dry on our side, its eyes clouded over, its skin drooping and its hair floating as if it were underwater. Slowly, as if attempting to form words, its lips moved. then knock. Inside of the glass. I stifled a shout and scurried out of bed so quickly that I almost ran into the wall. Melissa shot to her feet. What? What took place? I was unable to respond. I simply gestured toward the window, but it was gone when she looked. Just the tiny glimmer of moonlight on the waves and dark ocean. Melissa rubbed her eyes and scowled. You must quit watching those real crime documentaries right before bed, Evan. Jesus. Within minutes, she was snoring and flopped back down. I didn't sleep though. I was unable to, because the glass remained wet even after the face disappeared. From the inside, I kept the water on the inside of the glass a secret from Melissa. She had already assumed that I was laughing, and perhaps I was. However, I couldn't get rid of the impression that it was taunting me, as if the ship itself was daring me to speak up when the sun rose the following morning and that viewport appeared immaculate. The second day was meant to be enjoyable. Melissa devoured stacks of waffles like she hadn't eaten in weeks when we went to the buffet for breakfast. Distracted by the faces surrounding me, I picked at my plate. There was something off about the passengers. It wasn't that they appeared odd. Rather, they appeared normal. Perfect grins, well-groomed attire, and well-practiced, courteous chuckles. Every time I got someone's attention, they would look at me for a second too long, then turn away and smile. I felt as though I had entered a room where a patient had passed away, but no one was willing to publicly announce it. Melissa was unaware. She persisted in trying to get me involved in karaoke, poolside games, and shuffleboard. For her sake, I followed through, but the face at the window kept coming to mind. I told myself I had dreamed it by the evening. Tiredness, stress, and residual nightmares from too many poor shifts. Before we boarded, I had been up for over 30 hours in a row. Perhaps I had simply been deceived by my own head. The second night then arrived. After Melissa made me watch a comedy show that hardly made her laugh, we returned to the cabin late. She fell in a flash. The sound of the engines reverberated into my bones as I lay there in the dark. Make a knock. On the wall, 3 slow raps. The same as previously. I gritted my teeth and gazed at the dark ceiling. No, I wasn't going to play this game again. Next tap. Press. Press. Via the porthole. My chest constricted. Avoid looking. I warned myself. Don't look, please. However, curiosity itself can be poisonous. I turned my head slowly. It wasn't a face this time. It was a hand. Bloated, white, palm spread wide, flat against the glass. The fingers stretched nearly edge to edge and were overly lengthy. Water trickled down to the window's metal rim, beating on the inside of the glass. I shook Melissa awake as I staggered out of bed. Observe! Look, for heaven's sake! She sat up and moaned. I pulled her arm in the direction of the window. However, the hand was no longer there. It was a dry glass. Melissa glared as she withdrew. Really? For nothing do you drag me out of bed? She slipped back into bed and muttered to herself, I knew this trip was a mistake. You're not even trying to relax. My eyes hurt from gazing at the glass while I stood motionless. Then something changed. Not in the window, within the wall. Between our cabin and 6B, a slight bulge appeared in the plaster, as if something were pressing against it from the opposite side. I thought I heard breathing for a moment. Slow, deliberate, and heavier than any sound that should have come through steel walls. I took a step back until my legs struck the bed frame. I made the error of speaking at that point. Hello? The bulge ceased to move. Quiet. Relief flooded my chest as I nearly laughed at myself. The air, I swear, got chilly as someone said, Not yet, in a low, scratchy voice, directly against the wall. Unaware, Melissa muttered in her sleep. Shaking, I put my hand against the wall. The temperature was warm. It seemed overly warm, like if someone was breathing through it. I spent the remainder of the night awake. I watched the dim pulse of shadows where the bulge had been as I sat in the chair beside the entrance and stared at the wall. When daylight arrived, I sought clarification. I immediately went to the front desk to inquire about the 6B passenger. The clerk smiled at me courteously but hurriedly. 6B isn't there. I blinked. What are you discussing? 6A is where I am. She shook her head and wrote into her computer, "There must be someone next door. Because of renovations, cabin 6B is closed. It hasn't been occupied since the previous season." Unoccupied? My voice broke more loudly than I intended. Someone has heard me enter there. Last night, her eyes grew piercing, but her smile remained unwavering. "Mister." After saying, "That cabin is empty," she leaned closer and spoke in a whisper that only I could hear. "I wouldn't go looking for it if I were you." She straightened, her smile returning to its original position. "Enjoy your cruise." That evening, with my EMT flashlight in my fist, I pushed a chair up against the wall between our cabin and 6B. Melissa was upset with me because she claimed that I was pursuing ghosts and destroying the trip. But when the knocking resumed at around 2 in the morning, she eventually woke up and heard it as well. The color left her face. Silently, we listened to the knocks as they traveled from the wall to the porthole. Then there was a scraping sound, metal against metal, like nails pulling down the window frame. Melissa gave my hand a painfully firm squeeze. The lights in our cabin then flickered, as though the ship itself was joining in. Once, twice, then passed away, leaving us in complete darkness. I promise we weren't alone in that darkness. Darkness. It was the kind of stifling darkness that engulfed every outline and left you unsure of where the walls ended and your own body began, rather than the lovely, soothing darkness of a bedroom with the curtains pulled. My arm was pierced by Melissa's nails. She was shaking next to me. "Ethan?" I had never heard her whisper sound so faint. "What just took place?" I struggled with the switch as I lifted the flashlight. Nothing. Hoping for a spark, I smashed it against my hand, but it remained lifeless. The sound of dripping water came from somewhere in the darkness. It was heavier, rhythmic, and not from the bathroom or the sink. Let it drip. Let it drip. Let it drip. It seemed as though something was slipping into the cabin from above. Blindly, I extended my hand and touched the damp wall. "Melissa, pay attention." The knocking resumed. It wasn't coming from the wall this time, though. The room contained it. From someplace close to the foot of the bed came 3 slow, purposeful knocks. Melissa drew herself close to me and whimpered. I trembled when I spoke. "Who's there?" The response was the same low rasp I had heard the previous evening. "Not yet." The smell of salt water filled the air, making it humid. Melissa held me so closely that I was having trouble breathing. At last, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a drab red glow around the cabin. The inside of the viewport was entirely foggy, with ragged lines of condensation that looked like fingers dragging through them, and a face pressed up to the glass, but not in the same way. This one was nearer, clearer, its features warped as though it were submerged and crushed against the window. The eyes were unblinking and milky white. A silent cry hung from the gaping mouth. Melissa cried out and clambered into the bed. I pulled her away from the porthole by grabbing her wrist. There was a creak in the glass. It seemed as though something was pushing on the ship from the outside, not from its motion. Tiny fissures protruded from the sides. "We need to leave." Melissa sobbed. While struggling with the door lock, I pushed the chair out of the way. The door refused to move even though the handle turned. The exterior felt like it was crowded. The voice rasped behind us once more. "Not yet." I whirled, my heart racing. The wall between our cabin and 6B was the source of the sound. Melissa sobbed as she gripped my arm. "Open it, Ethan, please." I pushed the door with my shoulder. Once, twice. We staggered into the hall as it exploded open on the third attempt. The silence in the hallway seemed uncanny. Not a single traveler. Not even the ship's engines humming. Nothing but quiet. Melissa's eyes were wet and wide, and her chest heaved. "We'll head to the desk." I nodded, but I continued to look back as we moved. The lights flickered with each step as the hall extended in both ways indefinitely. And I thought I heard footsteps following us from behind, steady yet faint. We arrived at the desk. As though nothing was amiss, the same woman sat there with a fixed smile. My voice was shrill as I said, "Our power went out. Someone is in 6B. The porthole is damaged, and our cabin is wet. We need help. Her eyes darted past us down the hallway where the shadows appeared to ripple as if something were passing through them, but her smile remained unwavering. She whispered, "I told you not to go looking." Melissa hit the counter with her fists. "What's going on aboard this ship?" The woman spoke in a barely audible voice as she drew closer. Melissa angrily shook her head, saying, "He isn't ready yet." "Who isn't prepared?" The cashier looked from me to our cabin and back again, and she cracked a smile for the first time. "Run!" The overhead lights abruptly went out once more before we could react. Complete darkness. And as if the ocean itself were pouring through the ship's veins, the sound of rushing water filled the hall in the darkness. The corridor disappeared into darkness. I initially believed I had lost my sight. Suddenly, the air became so frigid that I could see my breath. Melissa trembled next to me as her claws drove into my wrist, whispering, "Ethan, it's here." The sound of water gushing intensified, filling the decks like a burst pipe. However, it wasn't originating from a single source. Everywhere was the word. The walls were dripping. Underfoot, the carpet squelched. The air itself had a salty taste. My hand fumbled for Melissa's. "We relocate. Right now." "Follow me." With only instinct to guide us, we staggered ahead through the darkness. With each step resonating like though we were entering a cavern, the hall seemed to be longer than it had ever been. Something slapped the floor somewhere behind us. Damp footprints. Slow. Intentional. Slap, slap, slap. Melissa let out a whine. "Ethan, don't turn around. I wanted to comply. However, curiosity is poison." I took a look behind me. I saw the smallest shape of a man through the darkness. It was tall, stooped, dripping wet, and pulling something long across the floor. As if he had just been hauled out of the sea, his hair was plastered to his face, and his head fell low. The pace of the footsteps increased. Melissa was jerked forward by me. "Go!" The floor was slippery with seawater as we ran. The ship's geometry twisted in strange ways, and the corridor bent at strange angles. I heard the figure closing in on us. My spine tingled with every smack of its bare feet against the ground. Ahead came a door gleaming dimly, unnaturally against the twisted corridor. Perhaps a lifeboat access? "Go." Melissa and I slammed the door behind us after I pushed her through first. There we were, in a stairwell. Overhead, the emergency lights buzzed a faint red. Melissa gripped me, her eyes wild, even though my chest heaved and my lungs burned. I saw Ethan. Between sobs, she blurted out, "I saw his face." He looked pale and bloated, as if he had spent weeks submerged. However, his eyes, she shuddered viciously. They were completely exposed, white. I gripped her shoulders more tightly, as if he were drowning even as he stood there. "We will not return there. We are looking for someone who can assist us." "A captain, a member of the crew. Is there anyone who isn't?" The door behind us shook. Once, twice, 3 jarring booms. I dragged Melissa down the stairs 2 steps at a time while she cried. Knocks, dragging, wet slaps reverberated across the steel walls as the sound pursued us. We rushed into a different hallway. It was not an empty one. In the center of the hallway stood passengers. 12 or more of them. Their complexion was pale. Their clothes were pouring, and they were saturated. They all remained silent. They didn't move. Their eyes were lifeless and hollow as they gazed at us. Melissa gripped my arm as she froze. I shook my head, saying, "Oh my God, Ethan, they're not real. There is something about them." We continued to move, squeezing past the figures. They gently turned their heads to watch us move. Seawater gushed from one man's mouth in constant spurts, his jaw hanging open as if it had been dislocated. Melissa let out a sigh. We passed them and were almost at the end of the hall when a voice rasped next to my ear. "This isn't happening." "Not just yet," I whirled. There was nobody. I turned around just in time to see Melissa's scream as it ripped through the air. The guy from 6B stood at the far end of the corridor, illuminated by the fading red lights. He wasn't merely observing this time. He was approaching us. Every step he took left a trail of water, and his damp clothing stuck to his skin. His claws screeched against the metal as he moved his hand along the wall. Additionally, he held a rope in his other hand. With each stride, the noose swung. I was pulled back by Melissa. "He's on his way. What do we do, Ethan?" My mouth felt parched. My heart pounded. Through the dread that was choking me, I pushed myself to say, "We run." We sprinted down the hallway, past cabins, and past the motionless occupants who made no move. The man's footsteps became more rapid and louder, until they seemed to be close behind us. We rounded a bend and collided with a tall, uniformed crew member. We were momentarily blinded by his flashlight. "Hey, why on earth are you down here?" He let out a bark. Melissa gripped him tightly. "You must assist us." "Something is pursuing us, a man from cabin 6B. The officer's face abruptly transformed. His face went white, and his jaw tensed. He glanced back at us after glancing down the hallway over our heads. "Go upstairs," Melissa cried now. "You believe us?" He grimly nodded once. The lights flickered wildly while he was saying, "Because if you saw him, you're already in danger." We were pushed toward the stairway by the cop. "Go, I'll keep him away." Melissa pulled me along as we staggered onto the stairway, her sobbing resonating against the steel. But I looked back just before the door closed. With his lights up, the officer remained standing, and it was just a few feet from the figure from 6B. I heard the cop shout as the door closed. Then there was quiet. We took off running. We were so terrified that our legs could hardly keep up. Melissa's sobbing ripped through the metal stairway as she clutched to me as if she would drown if she let go. I can't even recall the number of flights we ascended before we exploded into a sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. This place was silent, too silent. I briefly believed that we may have escaped. Then I noticed the puddles. The cabin doors were leaking water. Prolonged paths shimmered on the carpet, extending like veins in our direction. And the same 6B appeared on every door number we passed. Melissa's voice broke as she abruptly stopped talking. No, that isn't feasible. All of the doors we attempted led back to the same cabin. The same wallpaper damaged with mold. Wet sheets on the same single bed. A black, infinite ocean is visible from the same aperture. Melissa gripped her head tightly, whirling. We're confined. I gripped her shoulders and said, "We're in his world now." No, he has a desire. He's showing us, not just chasing us. A door behind us creaked open as though the words had called for it. We pivoted. Soaked to the bone, the figure stood in the entrance. His lips were split, water trickling from every pore, and his pale, swollen face slumped unnaturally. He fixed us with his huge, drowning eyes. In his hand, the noose dangled softly. Melissa backed into me and screamed. My body was paralyzed, shackled to the ground by fear. Even though my instincts told me to go, the rope was raised by the man. Not to us, to himself. And I saw it in that moment. He formed a single syllable with repeated, silent movements of his lips. Melissa gasped. "Help! He doesn't want us dead, Ethan. He wants us to complete what he was unable to." The figure approached, dripping water into the hallway with each step. At my feet, he dropped the noose. The rope curled in my direction, writhing like a living creature. My hands trembled badly. I can't do this." Melissa knelt, her eyes wide, amazed but enthralled. "If we don't, he might keep us here indefinitely." The corridor twisted behind him, just like the others. From the doors came dozens of drowned, pallid individuals staring at us with vacant eyes. 6B claimed all of the passengers and crew. Their voices gurgled with water as they whispered together. Melissa seized the rope and shoved it into my hands, saying, "Come along." Her face was damp, not only from weeping, but also from the salt water leaking into the atmosphere. "Go on, Ethan. Before he takes us, let him go." The man who had drowned was inches away and looked down at me with beseeching eyes. I can't recall coming to that conclusion. My body did the moving for me. I encircled his head with the noose. He grinned as soon as the rope hit his neck. The world then fell into the water. I was drowning, thrashing, and suffocating in a bottomless black ocean. As the tide dragged Melissa away, her hand left mine. Bubbles and shadows invaded my vision, and my lungs burned. Then there was stillness. In my cabin, I woke up. dry sheets. Streaming through the porthole was bright daylight. Breakfast meal is calmly announced over the ship's intercom. I almost believed that everything had been a nightmare. However, my feet splattered into a puddle when I rolled out of bed, and there was a rope neatly coiled on the desk. The noose was damp. I never stayed on that cruise again after that night. I kept the incident from the crew. I was afraid. I smiled, nodded, and played along as I stepped off the ship as if nothing had happened when we docked. Since then, though, I've heard water trickling close to my bed every night. I occasionally catch a glimpse of a man standing in the shadows, waiting with his neck cocked slightly to the side. Cabin 6B is not confined to the ship. It comes after you. I'll leave you with the thought that haunts me every night. Did I simply inherit his curse, or was I meant to release him? The next time you make a cruise reservation, keep that in mind. To ensure you don't miss what happens next, turn down the lights, subscribe to Midnight Outcry, press the bell, and let me know in the comments. Story 2. Have you ever booked a cruise with the expectation that it will be the most enjoyable vacation of your life, only to discover that you have entered someone else's nightmare? For me, it began like that. I had assumed that this vacation would be about sunsets, cocktails, and the sound of the waves lapping against the hull. One thing, though, that no one can prepare you for is that the ocean can occasionally bring secrets in addition to tourists and laughing. I felt liberated the first night as I stood on the deck and felt the sea breeze on my face. Around me, couples were taking pictures. Children were running with ice cream cones that melted before they could consume them, and people were laughing. Everything was lively, colorful, and noisy. Despite everything, I couldn't help but notice the ship's windows, which showed rows and rows of cabins that glowed like a floating hotel. There are too many windows and shadows. As you can see, I was given mid-deck cabin 6B. A bed, a desk, and a tiny porthole window are the only amenities in a typical stateroom. Even yet, I felt as though I had entered a place where I didn't belong as soon as I walked in. Have you ever been in a room that smells like it has been waiting for you despite the fact that you have never been there before? Yes, that. At first, I dismissed it. Nerves, excitement, a long journey, whatever. I put my phone on the nightstand, hung up 2 shirts, and unloaded my luggage. Typical. Totally typical. However, there was a folded piece of paper inside the desk's top drawer when I opened it. It was old and wrinkled, like it had been opened and shut 100 times. Brochures and menus are always left laying around by the cruise line, right? However, this was neither a welcome letter nor glossy paper. In unsteady pen strokes, this was scrawled. I'll confess that I'm always overcome by my curiosity. I opened it then, and the lines, which still make my chest clench, were brief, hurried, and written as if someone had been in a hurry. If you're reading this, get out of cabin 6B. Do not remain the night. Be wary of the mirror. I swear my heart stopped. I chuckled hesitantly at first. Perhaps it was a strange practical joke. Before me, some guests thought they were humorous. But who can even open this drawer? Perhaps housekeeping. However, the writing came out as desperate, not amusing. It's no joke. I stuffed the note into my pocket, folded it back up, and tried to relax. The mirror? Even so, what did that mean? The room had only one mirror, a large rectangular steel-framed mirror above the desk. Not hurt, only a mirror. However, it felt heavier every time I looked at it following that note. This is where things became more bizarre. I was not prepared to sit in complete darkness with that foolish letter rattling in my mind, so I left the little lamp on after taking a shower and getting into bed at around midnight. The waves outside tapped softly against the hull, and the steady, almost soothing hum of the engine below. I was about to close my eyes when tap. The waves? No, it was sharper this time, like glass being wrapped by knuckles. I immediately sat up and looked out the porthole. Nothing. The sea was limitless and black, not in the middle of the ocean where no one could be. Then it happened once more. Press, press, press. However, upon turning, I discovered that the sound had not originated from the window. The mirror was the source. I saw it, I swear on everything. Like disturbed water, the smallest ripples spread over the glass. And there was a face staring back at me for a moment. A blink, not my. Pale, icy eyes. Then it was gone. Heart in my throat, I staggered out of bed and fumbled for the light switch. The mirror, however, was only a mirror when the cabin was filled with light. A wide-eyed reflection of myself was staring back at me. I then recalled the letter once more. Do not trust the mirror. You would think that I would have departed at that point. I selected a new cabin, packed my bags, and requested a transfer. But the problem is, who do you even inform at this hour on a ship like this? Pardon me, there are ghosts in your mirror. I'd be laughed out of guest services by them. In order to avoid coming across as crazy, I did what most people do, which is to tell myself it was stress, a light trick, jet lag. Perhaps even the consequences of the 2 drinks I drank at supper. But I knew better in my heart, because I saw something in the mirror once more, right before I eventually made myself lie down again. Not the face. The ripple! No! The letter's corner that I had stuffed in my pocket, it was no longer folded in the reflection. It was exposed. The words stared back at me. There. This time, though, there was an additional line written beneath it in dark, irate strokes that I had never seen before. You won't leave. At that moment, I understood that the mirror was doing more than merely reflecting me. It was warning me of what lay ahead. When I woke up the following morning, sunlight was barely visible through the porthole. I nearly convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare for a brief minute. Isn't that what happens? When you awaken, the edges of reality seem less jagged and a little safer. Then I turned to face the desk. Sunlight was bouncing off the mirror and traveling in a narrow beam across the room. Typical. Completely typical. Aside from the letter, that is. I was certain that I had left it folded in my pocket before falling asleep. But there it was, there beneath the mirror, lying flat on the desk, unfolded. Additionally, the frenetic scrawl of handwriting appeared fresher and darker. As if the ink had not dried, I kept my hands off of it. With my pulse racing and just partly dressed, I retreated from the desk. My initial thought was straightforward: leave. Simply go out of the room, if only for a few hours. So, I did just that. I made my way directly to the upper deck. Now the ship was alive, with couples sprawled on deck chairs, waiters carrying trays of drinks, and children splashing in the pool. Typical, noisy, and secure. I told myself that over and over. I felt crazy because of the contrast between the icy fear of cabin 6B and the bright, laughing environment up here. Observing people's faces, I wondered if any of them had discovered notes similar to mine. Did anyone else notice something that shouldn't have been in the glass? However, everyone appeared so relaxed, as if this ship had never experienced any problems. I couldn't get the thought out of my head, though. I ultimately confided in someone. Julia was her name. She was in her mid-30s, had a keen smile, and like me, traveled alone. She had indicated that she was interested in weird stuff, paranormal podcasts, Reddit threads, and ghost tours when we had first met at the buffet the previous evening. I so blurted out more than I intended to when I saw her drinking coffee at the railing. I informed her about the tapping, the mirror, and the note. I thought she would chuckle. Rather, she cocked her head and narrowed her eyes as if I had just validated her suspicions. "Are you in cabin 6B?" she inquired. My stomach knotted at the way she said it too quickly, too sure. Indeed, why? Slowly, she put down her coffee. About that cabin, I read. It had a missing guy 2 years ago. I swear my skin turned cold when the crew stated he must have fallen overboard. Although the last time anyone saw him was in front of the mirror. Julia dropped her voice and leaned closer. According to several Reddit users, his roommate also discovered a note. Similar to yours. I wanted to accuse her of being insane. I wanted to dismiss it with a joke. However, I could tell she wasn't making anything up by the way her voice wavered at the edges. Worse, she wasn't shocked. I made an effort to stay away from my cabin that night. I remained out late, explored the ship till my legs hurt, got drinks, and saw a live performance. But fatigue prevailed in the end. I had to return. The hallway that led to cabin 6B was less bright than the others. It seemed as though one of the ceiling light bulbs was constantly flickering. After sliding my key card and entering, I froze. The mirror. It felt alive, and I'm at a loss for words. In the dim light, the surface glistened slightly, as though it were breathing. I threw off my shoes and went into bed, forcing myself not to look at it. I had a straightforward plan. Turn on the lights and try to remain up as long as possible. But I awakened up to the sound of footsteps at precisely 2:17 a.m., not outdoors, within my cabin. My body became immobile. The carpet was traversed by slow, methodical steps. I felt as though I was being held down and pressed against the mattress when I attempted to force my eyes open. I heard it after that, a voice whispering next to my ear. The identical words from the mirror, "You won't leave." When I opened my eyes, the cabin was deserted. With one exception though, I was no longer reflected in the mirror. Someone standing at the foot of my bed was reflected in it. I refrained from screaming. I was unable to. My chest was too constricted to eject even a whisper, and my throat became shut up. I simply gazed at the figure that shouldn't have been there in the mirror. Tall, dark. The way the shoulders hunched didn't seem natural. It was like the bones were bending in unexpected ways. Nothing about it had a face, but I could feel its eyes on me despite the bent head and hidden face. I blinked once, fervently hoping it was a light trick. The figure was still there when my eyes opened. I am still at my bed's foot. The problem is that it wasn't actually in the room. In the mirror only. I was aware that the area in front of my bed would be deserted if I looked. I didn't want to test it though. What if it wasn't, after all? How long I laid there is unknown to me. Minutes, seconds, perhaps an hour. My body refused to comply. The only sound in the chamber was the little creak of the ship against the waves, and my breath came raggedly and shallowly. The person then slowly lifted one arm. The hand pointed, or what appeared to be a hand, at me. I was devastated by that. I sprang to my feet, almost toppling over the bed, and turned on all the lights I could locate. The mirror returned to normal as soon as the room was illuminated. Just my reflection, eyes wide, pallid, and shaky. The figure has vanished, but there was another message on the desk. I had not heard anyone enter, I promise you. The document hadn't appeared to me. It was merely present. Identical handwriting. Stop resisting. I felt I might get sick from the way my stomach twisted. I poured cold water on my face, stumbled into the bathroom, and tried to tell myself that I was going crazy. Perhaps I had consumed too much alcohol, or perhaps stress had burned my brain. However, I then remembered Julia's reaction when I brought up 6B. She was aware of something. I was unable to remain in that room. Desperate to find a place with noise and life, I put on sneakers and set out to explore the ship at 3 in the morning. There was a thick silence in the hallways, as if all sound had been absorbed. I thought I heard faint, childish giggling on deck 5. I followed it around bends and turns, until I understood it wasn't coming from a rational place. The farther I turned, the farther it felt, never far away. I then ran across a member of the crew. I assumed he was crew, however. I couldn't quite make out the name tag, the white uniform, and the polished shoes. However, he simply looked at me when I asked him where the lounge was, not even blinking, not moving. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Then he turned and left down the corridor. Relief rising, I followed him until he rounded a corner, and he was gone when I rounded it a second later. The hallway is completely deserted. No hatch, no door, nothing. My heart nearly stopped, I swear. I took off running, where it didn't even matter to me. I eventually reached the upper deck. The night air was salty, harsh, and chilly, and it struck me like a slap. I briefly believed that I had at last achieved safety. Then I became aware of the waves. Their motion wasn't correct. Not like regular waves, which roll or smash. They were rising, rhythmically and slowly, as if there was life beneath the surface. And I heard it once more as I leaned over the railing and strained my ears against the wind. The murmur. This time there were multiple voices saying, "You won't leave." A chorus was heard, With my hair flying over my face and the wind ripping at my clothes, I staggered back from the railing. The muttering had continued. I tried to conceal them, but they slipped into my ears as they rolled with the sea air. Like the sea itself was chanting my name, I kept hearing the same thing. "You won't leave." It wasn't until someone grabbed my arm that I realized there was another person up there. Look no further. It was Julia. Her eyes were wide and darted about, as if she thought someone would pull her away. Her skin was strained and pallid, and she appeared thinner than before. What on earth is going on? I pleaded with her. My words nearly vanished into thin air as my voice broke. "What's in my room? Why are there notes?" She angrily shook her head. "You ought not to have remained in 6B. It was that cabin." She paused, looking around. Her hand gripped mine, trembling. "If I tell you too much, they'll listen to me." They never stop listening. My stomach turned over. "Who? The crew?" "No," she muttered, her lips hardly moving. My skin crawled when she uttered, "The ship," as if it were a truth rather than a metaphor. The ship's loudspeakers cracked before I could ask any more questions. Across the deck, a voice boomed, but it wasn't the typical upbeat announcements about supper or events. "Julia Green, a traveler. Kindly proceed to deck 2. Julia Green, a passenger, had lost all color in her face. "They are aware," she muttered. "I shouldn't have spoken to you." I attempted to seize her and restrain her, but she managed to break away with a strength I didn't believe she possessed. Before I could stop her, she ran for the stairway and vanished into the ship's belly. I stood there for a long time, trembling. Then I heard at the deck behind me creaking. All the deck chairs were facing me when I turned. Perfectly aligned rows that pointed in the direction of where I stood. They hadn't been like that when I arrived, I promise. I clutched my chest and rushed back inside, making a beeline for my cabin because, foolishly, despite everything, that still felt like the only place that was mine. However, I froze when I opened the door of 6B. There were no lights on. Faint moonlight leaking through the porthole was reflected in the mirror. Julia stood in the reflection as well. She wasn't in the room though, only the mirror. Her face was pallid, and she seemed to be softly screaming underwater as her mouth opened and closed. From the inside, her hands pressed on the glass. With my pulse pounding so hard that I thought I would faint, I stumbled back and slammed the door shut. The note was there when I opened my eyes once more, this time on my pillow. "You're next." I stayed up late. I was unable to. From the other side, I could always see Julia smashing her hands against the mirror when I closed my eyes. Around me, the ship made a creaking sound as if it were breathing. Through the walls, I could hear the water, but it wasn't the typical roar of surf. It was slower. It was as if the ocean itself was dragging unintelligible phrases across the metal hull. It was 3 a.m. when I gave up. I put on my sneakers and started to walk. There was silence in the corridors, too quiet. Usually, even at night, I would hear the muffled thump of music coming from the lounge or see an intoxicated couple laughing as they made their way back to their cabin. Nothing tonight. I became aware of the carpet at that point. It was wet. Down the hallway, a trail of damp footprints glistened dimly under the emergency lights. Tiny, naked feet. They headed directly for the bow. I ought to have gone back. However, I kept moving forward because of something inside of me that forced me to read Julia's notes rather than discarding them. I followed the footsteps down 2 flights of stairs and into the ship's interior, which was off-limits to passengers. The salt smell intensified, becoming almost metallic, and the air became heavier. As if the pressure were shifting, my ears popped. I located it at the end of a lengthy hallway, a door. Rusty, heavy, and the paint is peeling. "Cargo hold, no entry," was scrawled in black lettering over the front, and the footprints vanished beneath it. The handle shrieked on its hinges as I pulled it. The air within was dense with moisture and frigid. I exhaled clouds of breath, and a pool of water swelled up on the metal floor in the middle of that huge, gloomy room. It was completely black and motionless, as if the ocean itself had crept in and was waiting. With a thumping heart, I took a step closer. I noticed her at that point, Julia. With her hair falling over her face, she was kneeling at the pool's edge and talking into the water. Her own reflection was not the only one that shimmered. Below the surface, dozens more faces rippled. Pale, with wide eyes and wordless moans coming out of their mouths. All of them were trapped, pushed upward against that paper-thin barrier of water, albeit some appeared young and others elderly. I yelled her name. My voice broke. She jerked her head up, black, bottomless, and glistening with the subtle glimmer of the water. Her eyes were mistaken. Her mouth curled into an unnatural smile. After saying, "You shouldn't have followed," the water began to move. It rose as if it were hundreds of hands reaching for me, rather than a wave. I was pulled toward the pool by icy, slippery fingers that grabbed at my arms and legs. I fought and yelled, but the hold was iron. As she watched, Julia said something I couldn't make out. I was drowned without drowning as the faces in the water writhed, tugging, pleading. Her smile was the last thing I saw before I passed out. Then there was nothing but darkness. Story 3. Sometimes the places we believe will unite us instead serve to highlight our true distance from one another. What could go wrong with a peaceful home in the woods and a weekend away from the bustle? It's an escape for the majority of couples. It's the beginning of a nightmare for some people. Although Jake and Marissa were not yet in danger, they were beginning to exhibit signs of weakness. His shoulders were often weary from working long hours in construction, and his patience was always lacking. She was a painter and artist who yearned for attention that Jake didn't always get. Therefore, Jake accepted Marissa's suggestion of a weekend getaway in a secluded area of Oregon, even though it meant staying in a cabin that appeared older than the two of them put together and missing phone coverage. They got there right before dusk. Skeletal pines trembled and moaned as if communicating to each other down the dusty road that led to the cabin. The cabin itself appeared to have been staged. Too tidy, too spotless, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make it appear unaltered. There were windows that seemed a bit too reflective. A stone chimney with moss growing along its base. Jake squealed the ancient brass key and unlocked the door. He was struck initially by the scent of moist stone, cedar, and a hint of metal. There was only a kitchen with shabby worktops, a small living room with a stone fireplace, and a single hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. Marissa didn't notice. She was already grinning and stroking the rough wooden walls, describing them as charming. Given the heat of the day, the air inside was colder than it should have been. In an attempt to combat the cold, Jake rubbed his arms. Within minutes, the first strange event occurred. Marissa froze as she opened a drawer in the kitchen. There were wooden blocks, a broken porcelain doll, and a faded deck of cards among the children's toys within. They all didn't appear to be contemporary. The cloth doll was unraveling at the seams, and the paint was damaged. "I guess this place has history," Marissa said with a hesitant giggle, but Jake saw something she didn't. The dust inside the drawer had been disturbed. Lately, neither of them had anticipated the weight of the silence that night. The serenity of the forest differed from that of the city. With tiny cracks, distant moans, and the occasional scream of a bird far away in the trees, it pressed in from all sides. Marissa was fast asleep. Jake didn't. When he heard the slight creak of footsteps in the corridor, he laid on the rigid mattress and stared at the ceiling beams. Slow, even. An animal would be too heavy. He listened while holding his breath. Just outside their bedroom door, the steps came to a standstill. Jake waited for something, for Marissa to wake up, for a knock, but there was none. Nothing but quiet. "It's the house settling," he convinced himself at last. Ancient wood, old nails. He turned over and squeezed his eyes closed. However, he was awakened once more at 3 in the morning. Marissa was sitting up in bed, staring toward the corner of the room with her eyes wide open. She didn't respond when Jake whispered her name. She seemed to be mouthing something to someone as her lips moved slowly. Jake's heart pounded as he sat up. He looked after her. There was nobody in the corner, but the air grew colder the longer he stared. The thin white puffs of his breath escaped. Then he heard a little chuckle, so quiet it was nearly impossible to hear. It was a faint but distinct giggle. No creak, not the old cabin's moan. The mischievous, almost taunting laughing of a youngster. Marissa's eyes were still fixed on Jake when he froze and looked around the corner. As the scream faded into nothingness, she didn't even move or blink. He shook her shoulder and said, "Marissa." Suddenly, as if waking from a trance, she blinked. Her face was filled with surprise as her head jerked in his direction. "What?" Jake remarked. You were speaking to someone." He didn't like how little his voice sounded. "Marissa scowled." "You weren't. I was asleep." She rolled her eyelids, fatigue already taking over. "I was dreaming, Jake. Please don't freak me out." She pulled the covers up to her chin and lay back down. Her respiration returned to normal in a matter of seconds. Jake, however, remained awake. That giggle had seemed to reverberate in the room for a little too long, and he couldn't get it out of his head. Marissa pretended nothing had happened the following morning. She giggled at Jake's sleepy face while making coffee on the old gas stove. She made fun of you by saying, "You look like you fought raccoons in your sleep." She dismissed it when he attempted to bring it up again, stating that he simply needed to sleep. By noon, the apprehension was nearly gone. With the light shining in gentle golden beams through the trees, the woodland outdoors appeared serene. Marissa was already sketching as she set up her easel by the window. The regularity of Jake's wood chopping helped him decompress. It nearly felt like a typical weekend getaway for a few hours. But right before supper, that tranquility was broken. Pale as chalk, Marissa returned inside after cleaning her brushes. "Jake," she said softly. He trailed her to the side of the cabin and said, "You must see this." Although the ground was wet from a recent downpour, it wasn't the mud that attracted his attention. The footprints were the cause. Tiny, naked, kid-sized. Starting straight from the tree line, they made their way to the cabin wall, pausing just below the window of the room where they had spent the previous night. Jake touched the indentations while crouching. Neither time nor wind had yet to fill in the freshly compressed dirt. He said, "Could be an animal," but he knew he was not telling the truth. "Animals don't leave feet," Marissa said abrasively in a whisper. They secured the windows and doors that evening, keeping a chair beneath the handle for safety. When Marissa put down her wine glass, her palms trembled despite her best efforts to shrug it off. Jake woke up again around midnight, but this time it was a sound that made his blood freeze, not footsteps. The rocking chair in the living room made a distinct creaking sound. Slow, steady. Squeak, pause, and then squeak. Jake strained his ears and sat up. He could immediately tell that Marissa heard it too, since her eyes flitted wide. The sound lasted about a minute before coming to a sudden halt. Quiet. Then, a gentle lullaby drifted up from the living room, like a thread twisted too tight. Not on key. A voice too young to be in that cabin hummed. Jake's throat tightened each breath. He was afraid to move. Marissa's nails dug into his flesh as she held his arm so hard. Then the lullaby stopped as abruptly as it had started, but not before they were both chilled to the bone by a final note that seemed to whisper through the mansion. Jake was at his breaking point. His natural tendency was to remain in bed, shut himself in, and bide his time till daybreak. He couldn't sleep, though, since he kept thinking about that melody and how boldly it floated through their cabin. Despite Marissa's muttered protest, he crept out from under the blankets. "Don't, Jake. I must," he whispered. He slipped toward the door, making the floors quiver under his weight. The silence made every stride seem more significant. His hand shook when it made contact with the knob. Slowly, he opened it and looked into the corridor that led to the living room. Dark. Still. Too recently, though, the chair had halted. Someone, something, or both had been present. Grabbing the flashlight they had by the bed, Jake turned it on. The beam illuminated the rustic beams above and the small corridor as it sliced through the darkness. His movement disturbed the dust motes, which swirled languidly in the light. His gut churned as he stepped into the living room. Facing away from him, the rocking chair was at a little incline. He was sure it had been against the wall before they went to bed, and that in itself made him uneasy. He took a step forward, illuminating the cabin. Nothing. Not a move. Not a trespasser. Only a chair, a tiny wood stove, an old couch, and something on the seat. Jake stopped. A tiny item lay nicely in the middle of the couch. A toy for kids, wooden, carved by hand. A little equine. It had a smooth surface, as if it had been held and cared for many years. Jake felt a prick in his flesh. Slowly, he turned and looked around the room once more. His ribs were thudded by his heart. "Marissa," he muttered in a raspy voice. Pale, she clutched the doorframe as she stood at the end of the hallway. She shook her head in shock as her gaze flitted to the toy. Jake forced words out of his constricted throat and swallowed hard, saying, "That wasn't here before." The cabin grew quieter, pushing in on them both as they said, We don't own that." Marissa glanced in the direction of the window. Jake felt ice in his veins as he followed her gaze. Outside, the faint outline of a handprint was pressed against the glass. Tiny, kid-sized, and damp, like it had just been put there. Marissa covered her mouth with a hand clap. Jake almost dropped the torch as he staggered back. There was one creak in the rocking chair. Only once. Enough to cause them to stumble in the direction of one another. With a dull thud, the toy horse fell to the ground. Jake heaved his chest. Despite his desire to toss the toy into the flames, he had a gut feeling that it would be worse. Instead, he kept his gaze on the window as he slowly retreated toward Marissa. However, the handprint was already disappearing, as if the glass had never been in contact with anything. They heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the hallway they had just entered. Light, hurry, like a kid running without shoes. Marissa held his arm tightly. Jake didn't realize it was inside. Grabbing Marissa's hand, he pushed her out into the corridor. Following the faint patter of footsteps echoing around the cabin, he swung the flashlight left, then right, causing the beam to tremble. They were too light to belong to an adult. Their lightness was obvious, like the sound of a small person darting around idly and carelessly. However, it was not lighthearted. Jake had a strong feeling that this was not a game. Breathing heavily, they put their backs against the wooden wall. Marissa's fingernails dug into his flesh as she clutched his arm. "Jake, it's just us." She repeated the phrase, "just us," as if it were a chant, but her shaking betrayed her. The sound of footsteps ceased. It was the kind of oppressive silence that made your ears ring. Jake took a step forward and gripped the flashlight tighter. The laser struck the end of the hallway after cutting through the darkness. They noticed it at that point. A shadow. Little, infantile, motionless as ever. They were confronting it. Jake's heart pounded so loudly that he was afraid it may reveal his identity. In his hand, the flashlight shook. "Who's there?" Despite his attempt at firmness, his voice broke as he demanded. No answer. Marissa gave his arm a tug. "Don't," Jake said, but he moved closer. The beam moved over the margins of the shade. He briefly believed he saw long, knotted hair. A face that is pallid. The eyes are too deep and dark for the light to reach. Then, like static on an old television, the shadow flickered and disappeared. Marissa let out a gasp. Jake frantically swung the flashlight, but no one was in the corridor. As if under invisible weight, the aged wood of the cabin groaned as it creaked around them. Then that lullaby, right there, but softer now, alongside them in the corridor. A lilting, melancholy voice that wasn't really a voice suddenly appeared out of nowhere and everywhere. The rocking chair was playing the same tune. Jake's throat became constricted. He said, "Why us?" A thud from behind them served as the response. The living room. They whirled around and hurried back down the corridor. Jake had left the toy horse on the floor, but it was gone. On the windowsill, it stood up, pointing outward. "Like you're waiting on someone." Marissa's voice broke as she shook her head. "This isn't random, Jake. This thing is aware of us." The lullaby intensified, encircling them until Jake felt lightheaded. His knees went weak. Just beyond the glass, he could almost make out forms in the darkness and movement. Kids, dozens of them, pale, faint forms swaying just outside the trees, as if they were everywhere in the woods. And all of them were humming. Jake stopped when he saw the window. The glass was fogged by his breath, yet beyond it, ghostly figures shimmered in the forest. Dozens, perhaps even more, of children waited at the tree line, their faces pale blurs, their tiny bodies motionless. But in one awful accord, they produced the lullaby and hum. Marissa staggered back and gripped the wall. "Those aren't children, they're not alive." Jake swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "So what on earth are they?" The glass was rattled by the toy horse. No wind, not a move. It just dropped, like if it had been pushed by unseen hands. The humming ceased. The chamber was filled with a hush so thick it crushed against their hearts. Then footsteps, small ones. Within, Jake whirled, directing the spotlight once more toward the corridor. His blood froze. They were no longer in the woods. They were inside. The black gaze of the pallid people were unblinking as they packed shoulder to shoulder along the hallway. They twitched their mouths but made no sound. A young girl in a ripped nightgown with her hair hanging in a tangled curtain is the only figure in the center. She took a step forward and pointed straight at Jake with her hand. His flesh pricked. Whispering, he said, "What do you want?" The young girl's mouth opened. Marissa shrieked, clutching Jake's arm. "Stay!" Her voice was not infantile. Rather, it was layered, echoing with innumerable voices, deep and hollow. No, we can't." But before she could say anything more, the kids rushed forward, their white bodies occupying the room, their hands reaching, cold and unyielding. The beam of Jake's flashlight sputteringly flickered. Hands were tugging and scratching at his arms. They were chilly enough to burn, but not unpleasant. Once more, the lullaby became louder, but this time it was inside his head, overpowering his thoughts. Marissa struggled and thrashed against them, but Jake saw they weren't attempting to harm her. She was being dragged over to the rocker. Now, as if demanding that someone sit, the chair swayed fiercely and slammed into the floor. Jake grabbed Marissa's hand and surged, pushing folks away. "We're heading out!" he yelled. However, she was staring at the little girl wearing the nightgown with wide eyes. Marissa's mouth quivered. Jake paused and said, "I think one of them is her. Who is she?" Marissa muttered, "My sister. The one who disappeared when we were children." The young girl cocked her head, and Jake briefly saw a glimpse of her face, younger but recognizable. Marissa reached forward and wept. "Really, it's you." Jake pulled her away. "It isn't her, Marissa. She's being used." When the flashlight eventually died, the cottage was enveloped in deep darkness. Furthermore, the lullaby roared in the dark rather than merely humming. The sound of the cabin door slamming behind them was Jake's final recollection, or smashing on them, perhaps. Jake and Marissa were never seen again. Unaltered, the cabin remains in those woods with its doors securely secured. However, locals talk about it, claiming that occasionally you can hear a faint lullaby as the wind rips through the trees. And if you look closely enough, you can see a toy horse waiting and rocking softly in the window. Story 4. I can still recall the first night when the sound of the water was meant to be calming, but instead, it seemed like a warning to me. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that the water was watching us, not only underneath us. I'm a 34-year-old freelance travel photographer named Daniel. I chose this trip to acquire content sunsets over vast waters, happy people, and fine dining rather than just to unwind. I believed it would be the ideal addition to my portfolio. But I would have destroyed my camera and never boarded if I had understood what I was getting into. From the outside, the Oceania Majesty appeared to be a perfect ship. Glistening white, 12 stories high, full of glass elevators and neon-lit lounges that shouted affluence. Couples were clinking champagne, children were rushing for the pools, and pensioners were already eyeing the buffet line as the passengers buzzed with enthusiasm. As though the ship were consuming the energy, everything seemed alive, almost too alive. On deck 8, I made myself at home in my cabin. Modern yet compact, with a queen bed, A TV hung on the wall, and a bathroom so tiny you could take a shower and brush your teeth at the same time. There was a slight metallic odor in the air, like iron and salt. An elderly man who introduced himself as Edward and a lively honeymoon couple from Texas were my neighbors. He looked courteous, but aloof, as if he didn't want to draw any attention. I attended the welcoming meal in the opulent dining hall that first evening. Chandeliers that wobble slightly with the motion of the water. Hundreds of people dressed in formal attire. The servers' smiles were excessively big, as if they had been instructed to keep their faces straight at all costs. My lunch was halfway through when I became aware of a problem. 3 people are sitting still at a table in the far corner, which is faintly illuminated. No talking, no laughing, not even eating. Hands on the table just looking straight ahead. A minute later, I turned to see the table was vacant, as like no one had ever been there. I dismissed it. Jitters during the first night. Perhaps they had just departed, but the hallway lights buzzed and flickered as I returned to my cabin. I briefly believed I heard my name being whispered softly, draggingly, directly behind me. My camera bag slipped off my shoulder as I whirled around. Nothing. There was nothing but the carpeted hallway that went on forever. I heard 2 crew members having a quiet argument along the railing over breakfast on the open deck the following morning. Even though I was unable to hear everything, the line, "Don't put him near the list, he can't know what's on deck 4, stuck in my head long after they had left. Which list? What was deck 4? Deck 5 was off limits to guests. From the safety briefing, I was aware of that. The atmosphere changed by the afternoon. The sky changed from azure to bruised gray as clouds quickly drifted in. I watched as the horizon vanished into dense mist, but the ship's public address system crackled with a happy voice saying, "Just a short patch of weather. Nothing to worry about." Passengers muttered about how unexpected it was. At that moment, I saw Edward, the elderly man from next door, standing by himself at the railing, his lips moving as if he were reciting or praying. When he saw me observing, his eyes briefly appeared strange. Wide and nearly gleaming in the gloom, not old and worn out. I couldn't sleep that night. Even though the thermostat was set to warm, my cabin was frigid. I woke up to the sound of rushing water around 2:47 a.m. Perhaps I had left the bathroom faucet running. However, the restroom was not the source of the sound. It originated beneath the bed. The carpet was wet, soaked through as though seawater was leaking up from the floor itself when I crouched down with my camera flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard it. My breath froze when I heard a muffled voice, like someone talking through water, coming from underneath the bed. "Don't stay here." My initial reaction was to gather my belongings and dash to the corridor. However, the hallway was absolutely dark with no lights when I opened the door. Faint silhouettes moved in the darkness, steady, purposeful shapes that drifted softly in my direction. With one hand gripping the knob and the other supporting my feeble beam of light against the darkness, I stood motionless in the doorway. The people in the hallway weren't moving like regular travelers. With their heads slightly cocked and their shoulders rigid, they glided slowly and continuously. As they approached, there was only the sound of fabric rubbing against the walls. No words, no breath. My instinct was to lock the door and slam it. However, as soon as I closed it, the cabin's air became heavier, as if the pressure had doubled. The temperature fell sharply. My breath became hazy. It felt like I had stepped barefoot onto ice, since the damp carpet was wetter and colder. I instinctively reached for my camera, not for protection but for documentation. Perhaps I reasoned that I could justify it later if I recorded it. The lens immediately fogged, as if the air itself didn't want to be photographed. Only static and dim images flitting too near the lens, like faces pressed against glass, were visible when I played the video again a few seconds later. By daybreak, everything appeared to be back to normal. The corridor was well lit, the carpet was dry, and sunlight streamed through the drapes. There was not a drop of water left. I would have thought I had dreamed it if it weren't for my thumping chest and the static-filled film on my memory card. That morning, I made myself act normal. Ate breakfast with other travelers. A family laughed close by, children splattering syrup on waffles, and the captain announced a beautiful day at sea. However, when I looked across the room, I saw Edward, the elderly man, sitting alone at a table, looking directly at me. His expression was everything but joyous, but he raised his glass in a lengthy, thoughtful toast. I decided I needed answers at that point. In reality, I was observing the staff while feigning to explore the ship for pictures. In this way, I was able to identify trends, such as specific pathways that employees avoided and authorized personnel-only doors that seemed to come alive as you passed them. Additionally, a number of crewmen always vanished into a stairwell that led down to Deck 4 at night. They didn't ever reconcile, always in isolation. Their eyes were always downcast. I was at my breaking point by the third night. I went with them. The stairs was lined with pipes that hissed like whispers and was darker and colder. My chest constricted as I descended farther, as if the air didn't want me there. I froze halfway down. A person was crying. A woman, her screams low yet frantic. Leaning over the railing, I peered down into the darkness. At that moment, I noticed a figure clinging to the pipes, a drenched person with pale blue skin and hair stuck to her face. She gave me a look. I staggered back, my flashlight trembling frantically as she muttered, "You shouldn't be here," water dripping from her mouth. The crying ceased. Once more, the stairs was deserted. With my heart pounding, I hurried back up and almost ran into a young crewman who was carrying a tray of supplies. When he spotted me, his eyes widened. He spoke in a low, somewhat hissing voice. "Return to your cabin, right now." Prior to your inclusion on the list, once more, the word that was cursed. I wanted to push him and ask him to explain, but he shook his head angrily and his face turned pale. Then he turned and disappeared down the hall as fast as he had appeared. I couldn't get rid of the fear that night. I seldom moved or ate. The ship was groaning against unseen seas and had begun to creak loudly. The unusual fog, which never seemed to clear, was discussed in whispers by the passengers. And my cabin phone rang at 3 a.m. I lifted it up with hands that were shaking. 3 words came out of a man's deep, moist voice that sounded like bubbles in water. Deck 4. The line died. Tonight, my skin pricked. I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a warning. However, I was aware that I was no longer safe. Not on that damned ship, not in the dining room, not in my stateroom. Worse, I had a horrible feeling that my name was already known by someone or something. Staring at the cabin phone as if it may call again, I sat on the edge of my bed till the mattress dipped under me. It didn't. The ensuing quiet, dense and waiting, as if the ship were holding its breath, was worse than the call itself. The 4th deck. My inclination was to shut the door, stay put, and hope the ship landed soon. However, the list that phrase kept repeating in my mind. Waiting in my cabin felt like lying down in a coffin and pulling the dirt over myself if there was, in fact, a list, and I was on it. So I departed at 2:45 a.m. The hallways were strangely deserted. No crewmen rushing around, no late-night wanderers. All I could hear was the ship's creaking against the waves, each moan resonating like a living thing through the metal walls. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing faintly before going off for brief periods of time. Every blackout lasted too long, and I was certain that the hallway had altered by the time the lights came back on the wallpaper, was distended with watermarks. The carpet was damp. The air changed when I got to the stairway, wet, cold, like a drowning body's breath. Patches of condensation were visible in the beam from my flashlight as they trickled down the walls and formed tiny rivulets that fell onto the steps below. The drop seemed to go on forever. A slender corridor at the base led into the shadows. The air smelt like ocean and rust, and the floor slanted slightly. The roof was lined with pipes that dripped continuously, giving the impression that the ocean was directly against the walls. Then I caught sight of them. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall. A faint chanting accompanied the warm light that streamed through the breach. They sounded like dozens of people praying different prayers at once, overlapping and murmuring instead of speaking in unison. My stomach turned over. It was a thick, oppressive sound that did not soothe. The wet carpet muted every step I took as I edged closer. The voices became more furious and louder until they abruptly stopped talking. The door opened more widely. Crew members stood in a circle inside. On the damp floor, candles flickered, their flames bending sideways as though the air were moving beneath the surface. A dark, cloth-covered object pulsated softly in the center of the circle, as if something beneath it were breathing. My foot moved on the ground. The squelch reverberated. The circle's heads all turned to face me, dozens of eyes, hollow and wide, staring together. One of them murmured, "Another name." His voice sounded dead and flat, as if it didn't come from a living person. Then came another voice. The others repeated it, forming a low chorus that echoed across the room, each voice melding into something inhuman. Add him to the list. I staggered back, my throat dry and my flashlight quivering. My body felt heavy, dragged down, like if invisible hands were gripping my ankles, despite my instinct telling me to run. The central piece of cloth moved. Something moved beneath it. Slowly, with a purpose. The figure below strained against the cloth, pressing upward until a wet hand, gray and bloated, with jagged and broken nails, pushed free. Water spilled onto the floor from the cloth and started to seep toward my shoes. None of the crew flinched. They simply gazed, eyes unblinking, lips moving in silence. I gasped. My flashlight wavered. Once more, the chanting rose. The hand then grabbed the floor and started tugging. I spun around and ran. Unnaturally, the hallway was longer than it had been. It sounded like a gunshot as the door behind me banged. Every stride felt heavier, as if the ship itself were pulling me back, even though my sneakers thumped against the damp flooring. By the time I exploded onto the stairwell, my vision was speckled with black and my chest was burning with pain. However, I dared not halt. 2 at a time, I clambered up the stairs until I fell against Deck 6's wall. My hands trembled badly. Even though I had never fallen in, my clothing were dripping with seawater. I also discovered something in my pocket that had never been there before, a piece of paper scrap. My name was scrawled in smudged pen on it. My fingers were shaking so much when I unfurled that piece of paper that the wet ink soaked my flesh. Staring back at me was my name, written in rough strokes, as if it were carved instead than written. The paper itself had a texture more akin to human skin than pulp, feeling wet and bloated. I immediately dropped it. The paper did not fall as it should have. Instead, it seemed to melt into the carpet as it adhered to the floor, curling and wrinkling. Like blood seeping into fabric, my name soaked into the fibers. I realized then that there was no way to outrun this beast. I tried to tell myself the following morning that it had all been a delusion, either from fatigue or from drinking too much cheap whiskey at the deck bar. But I saw how people stared at me when I stepped out of my cabin and into the hallways. Normally, courteous crew members nodded, but now they stepped back, whispered as I passed, and kept their eyes low. Additionally, the passengers didn't even appear to notice me anymore, as if I were already a ghost. I sat by myself at a corner table for breakfast. The daughter of a family at the next table over, who was around 6 years old, pointed at me and said, "Why is that man wet?" Her mother swiftly shushed her away from my gaze. However, my shirt was dry when I touched it. The uneasiness followed me around. My floor was skipped by elevators. I tried to open doors, but they were jammed. I had to ask a glum crewman for a replacement key card after mine broke. Without saying a word, he passed the card over the desk, and he flinched as if burnt when our hands briefly met. I realized by the evening that the list was more than just a superstition. It was a phrase. The voice then came back. This time, not over the phone, not by murmuring in the walls. I was standing at the railing, looking out at the infinite black lake, when it came from just behind me. "You were selected." I whirled, my heart thumping, but nobody was there. The only things swinging with the ship's motion are the vacant deck chairs. Once more, the voice grew closer and curled inside my skull. Avoid resistance. I staggered backward, clutching the railing until my knuckles grew white. The sea always collects her dew. The night air became foggy with my feeble gasps of breath. Then I noticed them. Shapes moved beside the ship out in the water. Dozens of them. Pale and swollen, their heads bobbed just above the water, their eyes reflecting the deck lights. With each swell, water poured out of their wide lips, and they were effortlessly and flawlessly keeping up with us. One raised its hand. The same decayed gray hand I'd noticed under the fabric. It was pointing right at me. I nearly knocked over one of the deck chairs as I stumbled back. I could hardly stand because my legs were shaking so badly. The words stuck in my throat as I tried to scream for aid. Then, I caught sight of another person out of the corner of my eye. At the far end of the deck was a traveler who appeared to be in their mid-40s. She was also frozen in the same fear, gazing out to sea. She turned her head slowly in my direction, and the same piece of paper was in her hand. Our gazes met. She raised hers just enough so I could see the ink smudged on it. Her name. She shook her head just a little, more like warning than denial. The lights then began to flicker. She was gone when they returned. All that was left was her paper, which was adhered to the damp deck. The ink was already fading, giving the impression that her name had been removed from existence. When I pushed myself to come closer, the paper with her name remained adhered to the deck. As though being drawn into the sea, the flowing ink was dripping toward the railing. I knelt, near enough to sense the damp chill emanating from it. Before my eyes, the lettering disappeared, leaving behind a soggy, blank shred that melted between my fingers. It was my duty to rush to the captain. I ought to have pleaded for assistance, sought explanations, or done anything else. But I knew in my heart what was going to happen. This was nothing new to the skipper. The crew had to. That's why they gave me that look. Resignation, not sympathy, not perplexity. The first name wasn't me. I wouldn't be the last either. I had trouble sleeping that night. Faint noises pulsated through my cabin's walls, like waves within the plaster. At first, the pounding was constant, like the ocean against the hull. The sound then changed. I had to put my ear against the wall to hear the whispers since they were so low. 4 a.m. Deck 4. Repeatedly. A chant. A call. Trembling, I remained in bed and tried to ignore it. However, the air became damper and colder. Wet as if I had been hauled from the sea, my sheets clung to me. The clock was glowing at 3:59. The door of my cabin creaked open on its own when the clock struck 4 o'clock. My body simply followed my commands. I didn't choose to move. Although there was no sign of wetness, the carpet squished beneath my weight when I entered the hallway barefoot. I was directed toward the lower decks by the passageway, which was longer than I had remembered and curved slightly downhill. I knew where to go at every curve and in every stairwell. My feet carried me flawlessly, even though I had never been to Deck 4 before. Then I was there. The rest of the ship wasn't like it. The smell of rotting and salt filled the air. The walls were dripping. Overhead, a single flickering bulb buzzed, creating more shade than light. A figure stood in the middle of the hallway. Not passengers, not personnel. Something halfway. As though I were looking at it through rippled water, its face became blurry. Its hands, however, were transparent, gray, bloated, with long, rigid fingers. The identical hand from the waves that had gestured at me. A book was held out. The cover was twisted and the leather was soaking through. There were rows and rows of names in the book when it opened. Some blurred, some scratched out. I looked through the pages till I found hers, the deck woman. A line that resembled a gash had been drawn over her name. The page then turned itself. There was mine, too. It was written in the same rough lines as the paper slip. I took the pen off the figure. I violently shook my head and retreated till I struck the wall. However, the passageway had become more constrained, with the seawater-laden air pressing in. I felt like my lungs were choking. The figure remained still. All it indicated was the line next to my name, which was awaiting my signature. I recognized then that the book was not dangerous. A contract was in place. If I didn't, I would disappear like the rest. Accept, and I'd stay, somehow. Once more, the whispers were louder and more persistent as they filled the hallway. Sign, sign, sign. I can't recall which option I choose. The pen was hanging over the page 1 second, and then the ink started leaking onto the paper. My hand moved by itself, using the same ragged strokes to carve out my signature. The murmurs ceased. The figure walked back into the shadows, closed the book, and tucked it under its arm. After 1 or 2 flashes, the light vanished. I was by myself. The ship appeared normal again when I staggered back to my berth, walls that are dry. The carpets are clean. The current time was 7:15 a.m., as if the night had vanished. However, I realized it hadn't when I saw my image in the bathroom mirror. Like those faces in the ocean, my eyes were white and hazy. No towel could remove the moist shine from my skin, and the book was on my bedside table where the piece of paper had disappeared to, closed, awaiting. 2 days remain before the cruise concludes. However, I doubt that I will be departing with the other travelers, because there are still blank lines that need to be filled when I open that book again. Story 5. The water has always seemed like the safest place for me. I trusted the sea, worked on boats, and grew up on the seaside. However, this one trip, one cruise, broke all of that trust. Something didn't feel right from the minute I stepped on board. The air itself seemed to be charged, as though the ship was holding its breath, but it wasn't clear enough to make me turn around. There was a weight I couldn't get rid of beneath the laughter, music, and clinking glasses. When the captain's voice greeted us over the speakers on the first night, I noticed something odd. His remarks were upbeat, but I heard a whispering sound in the background, so faint that I assumed I was dreaming. Dozens of overlapping whispering murmurs. The whispers ceased as the announcement was over. It was interference, I told myself. Comments. Anything typical. But it became more uneasy. Later, hoping to get some air, I walked to the upper deck. I became aware of it at that point. The ship remained motionless. I understand the delicate swing and the current's push, as well as how the sea feels beneath your feet. However, as I stood there beneath the stars, I became aware that there was absolutely no movement. No sway. No engine vibration. Nothing. Even though there was no land visible on the horizon, it seemed as though the ship was motionless and trapped in place. I gazed at the ocean as I leaned over the railing. It didn't look right. Too gloomy. Too quiet. The ship's reflection extended downward, as if the ocean were a limitless mirror with no depth. I saw the faces at that point. Pale outlines. Eyes too wide, mouths open in silent screams. Not all of them at once, but rippling in the reflection. And they disappeared, as if they had never been there when I took a step back. I ought to have returned to my cabin. I ought to have locked the door and made myself go to bed. But I had a need to understand what was going on. Have to go farther. I remained at the railing and said in a whisper, "What do you want if you're there?" Silence for a long time. Then, although the air was motionless, the sea below rippled. The voices I had heard earlier drifted back, around me like a circle closing in, and the ship's reflection trembled. Then, this time more clearly, one voice broke through the others, a kid's. "Don't stay." It vanished as swiftly as it appeared, leaving only the silence, the darkness, and my heartbeat hammering. That was only the first night. And each hour after that drew me further into something I wasn't prepared to confront. That night, I hardly slept at all. I swear I heard a faint knocking inside my cabin's walls every time I closed my eyes. Only 3 taps, then quiet, neither rhythmic nor loud. 2 taps after hours. After that, nothing happened for so long that I was almost certain I had just dreamed it, until it began once more. When daylight finally arrived, I was worn out. I knew it wasn't just me, though, when I stepped out into the hallway. Other travelers appeared exhausted as well, with pale features and sleep-deprived eyes. I noticed the looks, the way people avoided eye contact, the way whispering died when I passed, but no one spoke. Breakfast ought to have been reassuring. It wasn't. Despite being packed, the banquet hall was oddly silent. Every fork scrape and glass clink was too loud in the quiet as people ate as if they were forcing themselves. The crew grinned, but their grins appeared to be staged, fragile, and mask-like. I sat with Tom and Evelyn, retirees from Florida, who I had met the day before. Tom spoke softly as he leaned forward. "Did you sense it last evening?" I froze. "How do you feel?" "The knock," he muttered. Evelyn gave him a stern look and shook her head as if he had said too much. Tom, however, persisted. At first, we believed it to be the cabin next to us. I checked, though, and it was empty. There are empty cabins, and no one is sleeping there. Whispers, the water's faces. My skin pricked. I made an effort to keep myself grounded by laughing it off. However, Evelyn's first words were hardly more than a whisper. Her words hit me like ice. They don't like when you acknowledge it. She clammed up when I inquired what she meant, scratching her plate with her fork till my teeth ached. She resisted Tom's attempt to take her hand. The air between them was charged and heavy. I made the decision to explore the ship after breakfast. Perhaps moving might dispel the fear, I reasoned. However, I kept seeing things that didn't make up as I strolled around the hallways. The deck map indicated that the tunnel should loop back around, but it stopped in a blank wall, doors without numbers, cabins that didn't look right, as if the doors were painted outlines rather than actual ones. It was followed by the sound. I could hear a slow, dragging scrape coming from somewhere far below, under the floorboards, similar to metal on metal. Wherever I went, it seemed to follow me. By nighttime, I was sufficiently shaken to think of asking the captain directly what was happening. However, the man's smile stopped, and his eyes flashed past me as if someone was observing when I asked a passing steward where I could locate him. He stated bluntly, "The captain is not to be disturbed," and then he left without saying anything else. I made an effort to capture everything on my phone that evening, just in case. I lay in bed with a voice memo running. I remained motionless while the knocking resumed hours later. I simply listened. I heard 3 taps in the darkness. Next, 2. Then there was breathing, not mine. My face was drained of blood as I listened to the recording the following morning. Because there was a whisper when the breathing ceased, and it wasn't a kid's voice this time. Dozens of them were stacked and warped. My name was said. Something inside of me crumbled when I heard my name on that recording. I kept playing it over and over again in the hopes that I would be mistaken and that it was simply distortion or my imagination turning random sounds into words. However, I could clearly hear it no matter how many times I listened. My name. By breakfast, I was a complete mess. As soon as I entered the dining hall, I saw that Tom and Evelyn were not present. The back chairs where they usually sat were unoccupied, with no plates on them. When I inquired about whether they had eaten yet, one of the servers simply gave me that same impassive smile and stated, "Passengers move on all the time." His tone made me shudder. Move on, not transfer, not leave, just move on. I made the decision to inspect their cabin. The door was ajar when I got there. Everything was stripped bare within. As though no one had ever stayed there, the bed was made and the luggage was gone. All that remained was a slight, moist odor, like to seawater seeping into carpet. I swiftly retreated. The corridor seemed excessively still, and upon turning, I noticed a steward observing me from the end of the hallway, standing somewhat motionless. I didn't hold up on seeing what he would do. I tried to divert my attention that afternoon by blending in with the passengers who were lounging by the pool on deck. However, the vibe was incorrect even there. No one chuckled. The conversations were uncomfortable and subdued. People seemed to know they were going nowhere as they gazed out at the infinite horizon as if they were waiting for something. That's when I noticed it. A young girl in a faded blue sundress stood by herself on the far side of the pool. She was just staring at me without blinking or moving. She was gone as I blinked. It wasn't until the cold liquid soaked my hand that I realized I had dropped my drink. I was attempting to shrug it off when I murmured something to myself when Evelyn's voice said, "You shouldn't acknowledge them," immediately next to me. She appeared tired and pale, but she was still very much alive. She took hold of my arm with such force that it stung. Before I could say anything, she continued, "Don't ask where Tom is. Don't. Simply pay attention. They are consuming us. More of us are taken each night we remain here." The crew is aware. They continue to smile because of this. She aggressively shook her head when I tried to ask her what she meant by "they're part of it." "Stop talking here. Too many ears." She disappeared between sun chairs and slid into the crowd before I could stop her. I pushed a chair under the handle of my cabin door and locked it that night. On the nightstand, my phone was filming once more. Even though I vowed not to sleep, I fell asleep due to tiredness. I eventually awakened up to the scraping sound coming from the chair, very slowly. It was being dragged away from the door, inch by inch. With my heart pounding, I held my breath and watched the handle twitch. Then there was quiet. I waited. The seconds were counted. At last, I had myself get up and listen to the recording of the phone. The chair's motion was audible, followed by a prolonged silence. I didn't sleep again until I heard the words, "Let us in," said very softly and directly into the microphone. Knowing that something was standing outside my door, pleading to be allowed inside, how could I? I was trembling, worn out, and determined by dawn. There was more. Something below deck. Something Evelyn had alluded to. I would look for answers there if the staff was hiding it. I stayed out of the dining room. I felt sick at the idea of sitting there with all those happy servers around me. Rather, I wandered the ship, trying doors and searching for any areas where guests weren't allowed. The most were securely closed, but on deck 3, I discovered a service stairwell close to the laundry chute. "Crew access only" was written on a sign, and after a brief moment of hesitation, I slipped inside. The air instantly shifted, becoming thicker, colder, and slightly smelling of mildew and salt. The stairwell dropped sharply, far more than I had imagined. Before the wall started to perspire with condensation, I counted 5 flights, then 6. I pulled open a metal door at the bottom and entered a hallway that was faintly lit by red emergency lights. The ceiling was lined with pipes that steadily dripped into corroded drains. I heard voices. Chanting. Not exactly conversation. I drew nearer, following the sound until I came to a large room. I spotted them through a gap in the door. Simultaneously, dozens of crew members stood in a circle with their heads bent and muttering. There was a gigantic seawater tank in the middle, sloshing as if something enormous had been stirring it up. The faces crowded against the window caught my attention. Eyes wide and silent, screaming, pale and deformed travelers. Tom was one of them. Bile rising in my throat, I covered my mouth and staggered back. The chanting became more intense and steady, resembling a heartbeat. Then, as if something massive were attempting to escape, the water in the tank rushed upward and pressed against the glass. A hand suddenly clamped down on my shoulder. Evelyn. Her skin was damp, as if she had just climbed out of the ocean, and her eyes were wild. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. The chanting ceased before I could inquire what she meant when she said, "They already marked you." Deathly silence fell in the room. Then, slowly, each crew member looked in the direction of the door behind which I was hiding. The red glare caught their glassy, unearthly eyes. I was pushed back into the hallway by Evelyn. "Go!" she growled. Yes, I did. With the sound of footsteps not far behind, I ran up the stairwell. Something deep and guttural, a growl that wasn't human, vibrated through the walls. When I finally arrived at my cabin, I slammed the door and shoved the chair under the handle once again since my lungs were burning. The following morning, I ventured to check my phone's recording, only to find it corrupted. Until the very end, when a voice whispered my name, it was all static. Even though I'm back on land, I don't feel like I got away. I dream of that tank every night, of faces waiting for me, pressing up against the glass. In my apartment, I occasionally wake up to the sound of seawater trickling. Evelyn might have been correct. I might have been marked. Additionally, once the ship selects you, it could not let you go. I promised myself that I would never again go near the sea, that it would end when I got off the ship. However, fear follows, not the other way around. It waits. I discovered a wet footprint in my hallway the first night I was back home. Only one, too narrow, too lengthy to be mine. Despite the fact that it hadn't rained in weeks, I persuaded myself that I had brought in water from outside. I smelled brine when I woke up the second night. The carpet in my bedroom was soggy, like the water had been brought in. I thought I noticed movement at the foot of my bed when I blinked the sleep from my eyes. It was a form leaning forward, its hair floating like if it were floating in water. I turned the lamp on. There is nothing there, only damp footsteps returning to the corridor. I knew by the third night. The ship had not remained. Desperate to find evidence, I searched my phone once more. One file was unharmed, but the most were corrupted. It's not something I recall recording. I dropped the phone with trembling hands, but the audio was clear despite the black screen. It included the same low chanting, the sound of rushing water, and Evelyn's voice stating, "You can't run. The sea always collects what it's owed. The dreams have gotten worse." I return every night to the chamber below deck, where the water is churning and the crew is circling the tank. Glass is pressed up against faces. Tom, the elderly lady, people I've never met, and something larger behind them. Something with eyes the color of the deepest ocean was observing me. The taste of salt water clings to my tongue as I wake up gasping. I swear I feel something crawling in my throat when I cough. I keep getting comments about how pale I appear, that I have clammy skin, that I drag my feet when I walk, like if I'm carrying something heavy that I can't get rid of. I don't be honest with them, that water drips from my reflection when I pass mirrors, that my reflection occasionally lags behind, grinning dimly when I'm not. I believed I had gotten out of the ship. However, I believe I took it back with me. Or perhaps I never went anywhere. While something else wears my face on land, I might still be below deck, observing from within the tank. And if that's the case, you might want to stop watching this at now moment, because it will gaze at you next, if I'm already gone. Dim the lights, lock your doors, and if you're brave enough, leave a comment telling me what would you have done if you saw the faces in the tank.